In 1348, Florence, one of the wealthiest and most influential cities in Italy during the medieval period, was a hub of culture, commerce, and innovation. But behind its majestic walls, a far darker reality was about to unfold. Imagine yourself walking through those very narrow streets, listening to the murmur of merchants in their stalls and the heavy wheels of carriages clattering against the cobblestone streets, while the smell of fresh food mingles with the aroma of leather and iron. However, in the air, something was about to change. Something invisible, silent, but deadly. The 14th century, also known as the Middle Ages, was a time of transition in Europe, marked by a highly hierarchical society, with the Church wielding immense power over all aspects of life. Life in the city of Florence before the arrival of the plague was characterized by a thriving economy, a strong merchant class, and intense cultural activity. The city was undoubtedly one of the most important centers in all of medieval Europe, being a major hub for the wool trade, especially the production of fine textiles. But despite the visible wealth and vibrant daily life, the city was not immune to the tensions and struggles common to the era. The working class, peasants and artisans lived in harsh conditions, residing in cramped housing and constantly battling to survive. It was within this setting that, in the winter of 1347, a new enemy emerged. Without warning, the bubonic plague, one of the deadliest diseases ever known to humankind, arrived in Europe, carried by the same trade routes that connected the east to the west. Its origin traces back to the steppes of Central Asia, where Mongol troops, during sieges of cities, carried rats infected with plague-bearing fleas. When the rats and their fleas made their way to the commercial caravans traveling through Asia Minor, the disease began to spread with an unmatched speed. In Florence, as in many other cities in Europe, the arrival of the plague was a devastating tragedy, seeming to come from nowhere and wiping out everything in its path. At first, no one knew for certain how the disease was spreading, and the doctors of the time, with their rudimentary understanding of medicine, were completely unprepared. The disease, which caused high fever, intense muscle pain, and the formation of buboes, painful swellings in the lymph nodes, quickly spread throughout the city. In a place where hygiene was poor and doctors lacked the resources or knowledge to deal with the disease, panic took over the population. In the first few weeks, Florence was paralyzed. The trade system collapsed, the markets that had once been filled with goods were emptied, and the streets, once alive with the sounds of commercial negotiations, were now inhabited only by murmurs of fear and despair. The scarcity of food and supplies became an increasing problem, while the number of the dead grew at an alarming rate. Families began losing loved ones at an overwhelming speed, and in many cases the same doctors who had been called to help were themselves victims of the disease. The Church at first tried to deal with the situation in its own way. Priests organized masses and prayers to seek divine mercy, as many saw the plague as a punishment from God for society's moral decay. However, as the death toll rose, it became clear that spiritual responses and prayers were insufficient to contain the wave of suffering and death that was sweeping through the city. Churches, which had once been gathering places for communal prayer, were now empty, as the fear of infection made even the most devout avoid services. Picture the scene. The streets of Florence, once so bustling, were now covered by an atmosphere of silence and hopelessness. The carts that once transported goods now carried only the laments of survivors, while entire families huddled together in their homes, afraid of the disease's spread. During the day, the sound of hurried footsteps on the streets mixed with the rattle of doors slamming shut, and at night, the silence was almost complete, except for the sound of the church bells occasionally ringing, calling the few survivors to prayer or to take further sanitary measures. The immediate impact of the plague was immeasurable. In the first few weeks, the city lost thousands of inhabitants, and the few who survived faced a future full of uncertainty. Homes became prisons, and the public squares transformed into makeshift burial grounds as cemeteries quickly filled up. The authorities, in a desperate attempt to contain the epidemic, enacted drastic measures. Strict quarantines were established, and the city became almost completely isolated. But, as in all great tragedies, these actions were insufficient in the face of a disease that spread too quickly and with such force. You can imagine the tension, the panic in the streets of Florence during those days of terror. What was once a prosperous and lively city was now being consumed by death and fear. The economic impact was devastating. The production of goods came to a halt, the trade in textiles and other essential products ceased, and the remaining population had to contend with the harsh difficulties of a market in collapse, with no food and exorbitant prices for essential goods. The panic in the streets and the growing number of the dead were only the first signs of a society that was about to change forever. The sounds of the medieval city, the commerce, the debates between merchants, the voices of workers in the squares, and the laughter of children playing were all silenced by the presence of the invisible but overwhelming bubonic plague. Florence, the jewel of medieval Italy, was being overtaken by death, and its recovery would become a challenge that would require more than courage. It would require reinvention. As you walk through the streets of Florence during the outbreak of the bubonic plague, the once vibrant city now feels eerily deserted, and the usual sounds of merchants shouting prices, children playing, and carriages rumbling over the cobblestones have been replaced by an ominous silence. The air is thick with tension, a palpable fear that seems to settle in the bones of every living soul. The plague is no longer just a distant possibility. It is here, and its effects are devastating, sweeping through the city like wildfire, leaving death and despair in its wake. You are surrounded by people who have been marked by the disease in one way or another. Those who are fortunate enough to still be healthy carry with them the weight of a constant, unspoken dread. The streets are filled with people hurrying from place to place, avoiding contact with others, their faces covered with scarves or masks to protect themselves. Yet, despite these precautions, the fear of contagion is never far from their minds. Every cough, every sneeze, is a reminder of how close the invisible enemy is. The accounts of contemporary witnesses like Giovanni Boccaccio paint a grim picture of the chaos and fear that gripped the city. He wrote of the scenes in Florence where whole families were wiped out, and the streets became filled with the sick, the dying, and the dead. The disease spread so quickly that there was no time for proper burial. The dead were left in the streets, abandoned by family members who themselves feared for their lives. The social fabric of the city unraveled, and what was once a community bound by trade, culture, and religion now became a fractured, terrified group of individuals struggling to survive. The conditions in the streets were deplorable. In the absence of functioning public services, there was no one to help clear the bodies of the dead, and no one to ensure that food and supplies were properly distributed. The usual hustle and bustle of the marketplace had come to a halt, and what remained were only sporadic attempts to sell food and medicines, often at exorbitant prices. The once picturesque squares of Florence were now the scenes of despair, with people huddling in small groups, whispering about the disease, about their hopes and fears for survival. The air smelled not of fresh bread or flowers, but of sickness, of decay, and of the ever-present suffocating fear of death. Public services and social institutions had crumbled under the weight of the epidemic. The city's health system was overwhelmed, with too few doctors, and those who remained were often struck down by the disease themselves. The hospitals, already primitive by modern standards, were nothing more than makeshift places where the afflicted were left to die without proper care or attention. Law enforcement, which had once maintained order on the streets, was now non-existent. There were reports of looting and violence as people, driven by fear and desperation, tried to protect their families and their property. Those who were still well enough to leave their homes were left to fend for themselves, scavenging for whatever food and medicine they could find. The response from the authorities was swift, but not enough. In an attempt to control the spread of the plague, Florence, like many other cities, enacted quarantine measures. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off, and anyone found to be infected was either imprisoned in their homes or sent to plague hospitals, places where survival was rare. The city's once thriving religious institutions, which had always been central to life in Florence, were now closed, their doors locked against the tide of the plague. Churches, once filled with the faithful, were abandoned. The bells that once tolled to summon worshippers now tolled for the dead, their sound ringing out as a grim reminder of the city's dire situation. As you walk through the now empty streets, the echoes of the past feel like a distant memory. The religious fervor that once guided the lives of the people has been replaced by a new kind, fear. No longer do the priests stand in front of the altars, offering comfort and solace to the suffering. Instead, there are whispers of divine punishment, as people wonder whether the plague is God's way of punishing them for their sins. Some turn to prayer in desperation, while others abandon their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the suffering they see around them with the image of a merciful God. The streets once filled with the rich sounds of the faithful singing hymns are now silent, save for the occasional distant wail of a mourner or the hurried footsteps of someone trying to escape the grip of the disease. The quarantine measures, though intended to protect the healthy, have only added to the sense of isolation and helplessness. Families are torn apart as loved ones are taken away to plague hospitals, never to be seen again. The very fabric of society is coming undone, and the world that Florence once knew, its culture, its trade, its identity, feels as though it is slipping away. You can sense that the city, its people, and its way of life are on the verge of collapse, and there is no certainty of what will come next. As the days drag on, each hour feels like a battle against time, against the plague, and against the very essence of survival. The somber sounds that fill the air now are not those of bustling city life, but of the desperate, the dying, and the hopeless. The beating of doors, whether to keep out the disease or to prevent the sick from entering, is a constant rhythm, a reminder that despite all efforts, the plague remains ever present. The sounds of lamentations and prayers are mixed with the occasional toll of the bells, calling for another service or calling the faithful to reflect on their mortality. The city, so full of life, has now become a place of mourning, and it is clear that the Florence of old may never return to what it once was. As you walk, you realize that these are not just the streets of a city stricken by a plague. They are the streets of a city at the crossroads of history, where the future of its people, its culture, and its very survival will be determined. It is a time of uncertainty, but also one of resilience, for even in the face of the plague, life in some form continues. The people of Florence, battered and broken, will find a way to endure, and the city will in time rise again. But at what cost? The toll of the plague is not just in bodies, but in the heart of the city itself. The sounds of the city, once full of life, now tell a story of loss, survival, and the struggle to continue against all odds. The plague has taken much, but it has not yet claimed everything. As you walk through the city, you notice that Florence's leadership, in the face of this relentless and mysterious plague, is struggling to maintain any semblance of control. The authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis, are making desperate attempts to contain the spread of the disease. The streets once bustling with commerce are now haunted by fear, and the city's leaders, priests, nobles, and doctors alike, are locked in a frantic race against time. The city's rulers, in a bid to control the epidemic, begin implementing strict measures. The most significant of these is the enforced quarantine. The healthy and the sick alike are isolated in their homes, with heavily guarded barriers placed around entire neighborhoods to prevent movement and further spread of the plague. These barricades made of rope and wood often stand as grim symbols of desperation, confining entire families to their homes, unsure of when or if they will ever see the outside world again. Streets, once vibrant with the life of merchants, artisans, and noblemen, are now deserted, barricaded by makeshift walls. Doctors, few in number and even fewer equipped with any real understanding of the disease, attempt to treat the sick, often relying on crude methods that do little to alleviate the suffering. The medical profession at this point is still in its infancy. Most remedies are nothing more than superstitions, potions made from herbs, the burning of incense, or the application of foul-smelling concoctions to purify the air. There is no real understanding of how the disease spreads, and with no access to modern tools or scientific knowledge, these early attempts at treatment only serve to give the desperate citizens a false sense of hope. In a place where understanding is limited, the unknown can often be more terrifying than the disease itself. As you move deeper into the city, the contrast between the political response and the religious reaction becomes stark. The church, always a central institution in Florence, responds in its own way. But its actions are not solely focused on curing the sick. Instead, the clergy issue proclamations calling for mass penitence, believing that the plague is divine punishment for the sins of the people. The clergy preach that only through acts of humility, prayer, and repentance can the wrath of God be averted. The streets are filled with processions of the faithful, kneeling and weeping in front of the church, begging for divine mercy. Churches that had once been filled with the sounds of vibrant worship now echo with the solemn prayers of those hoping to save themselves, their families, and their city from the grip of the plague. There is a deep sense of spiritual fear in the air as people come to believe that the plague is a punishment for their moral failings. The idea that God has sent the disease to purge Florence of its sins becomes a central theme in sermons. The streets are filled with people walking in solemn processions, carrying candles and crosses, chanting prayers for forgiveness. You can hear the distant sounds of their voices echoing through the city, pleading for redemption. The rich and the poor alike, once divided by class and status, now stand together in their common fear of divine wrath. In their desperation, they seek solace in religion, hoping that their acts of devotion will spare them from suffering. The church, however, is not the only institution attempting to address the plague. The city's leaders also appeal to the medical community for answers, although there are few to be found. The response is inadequate, and even the most well-meaning efforts often fail to have any meaningful impact. In fact, the church's emphasis on divine punishment, coupled with the growing fear and paranoia among the population, leads to even more harmful behavior. People begin to turn on each other, accusing their neighbors of spreading the disease, and entire families are ostracized, left to fend for themselves in isolation. The public's faith in the authorities is shaken. The traditional hierarchies of power, the clergy, the medical professionals, and the noble families, are all seen as ineffective in the face of such a ruthless and all-consuming disease. Yet, despite the failure of these systems to provide answers, the city's population does not abandon its faith. In fact, the plague only strengthens the belief that the city's woes are tied to a spiritual reckoning. The need for answers, for some sort of meaning in the midst of such suffering, drives people deeper into their religious practices. As the days drag on and the death toll rises, the atmosphere in Florence becomes increasingly bleak. The city's leaders, in their attempts to control the disease, find themselves at odds with the clergy, who insist that the plague is a divine test. But in the end, neither the political nor religious solutions seem to make any real difference. The disease continues to spread, unyielding and indifferent to the pleas of the faithful or the decrees of the ruling class. In the face of such an overwhelming disaster, the people of Florence are left with little more than their faith and the hope that somehow, against all odds, they might survive. As you wander through the city, you hear the sound of church bells tolling, their melancholy chimes filling the air. The bells, which once signaled moments of celebration or prayer, now serve as a grim reminder of the city's tragedy. They ring not for joy, but for the dead, as each toll marks another life claimed by the plague. And yet, despite the suffering, despite the unrelenting advance of the disease, there is a glimmer of hope in the midst of all this despair. The people of Florence, battered and broken, still find solace in their faith, still hold on to the hope that somehow they will endure. And perhaps in time they will. But for now the plague continues to cast its shadow over the city, its grip tightening with each passing day. The church may have offered penance, and the city's leaders may have issued their decrees, but in the end, it was the people of Florence who were left to endure the suffering, the isolation, and the uncertainty. They would find no easy answers, no quick fix to the devastation surrounding them. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, one thing became clear. Florence, like so many other cities, was forever changed by the plague, and the aftermath would take generations to fully understand. As you walk through the streets of Florence, the scars of the plague are still visible, etched deeply into the city's architecture and its people. The once bustling squares, now nearly abandoned, are slowly beginning to show signs of life again. The walls of the city, which had been closed off to the outside world for so long, are now being repaired, and the voices of merchants and craftsmen can once again be heard, though still quieter than before. The air, thick with fear only months ago, is beginning to clear, and there is a sense of cautious optimism that now pervades the atmosphere. Yet despite the resurgence of life in the city, nothing will ever be quite the same again. The population of Florence, decimated by the plague, has been reduced by a third, if not more. The streets, once crowded with people of all walks of life, now feel eerily empty. The loss of so many citizens has left the city in a state of mourning, but also in a state of profound transformation. Families have been wiped out, and the social fabric of the city is irreparably damaged. Entire neighborhoods have been abandoned, and the once thriving marketplace has become a shadow of its former self. But amidst this destruction, something new is beginning to take shape. In the wake of the plague, Florence faces a new reality, a city with fewer people but more opportunities. The labor force, once overburdened and overworked, has been significantly reduced. This has led to a scarcity of workers, but also to an increase in wages for those who remain. The scarcity of labor has forced the city's economic systems to adapt. The power of the wealthy merchant families who had once controlled the economy through low wages and cheap labor begins to erode. The working class, emboldened by the demand for their skills, begins to rise in status. For the first time, the common people find themselves in a position of greater bargaining power, and the economic structure of the city begins to shift. As the economic system begins to adjust, Florence's social and political structures are also in flux. The aristocracy, weakened by the death of so many of their own, begins to see a shift in the balance of power. The church, once the most powerful institution in the city, is also affected. The plague has shaken people's faith in the religious explanations that had once been so central to their lives. The priests who had preached that the plague was a divine punishment are no longer seen as the ultimate authority. Instead, people turn to new sources of knowledge and power, and the intellectual and philosophical currents that had been bubbling beneath the surface of medieval Europe begin to rise to the surface. The impact of the plague on Florence is not only economic and social but cultural as well. The arts which had flourished during the height of the city's prosperity are now re-examined and reinterpreted. The devastation caused by the plague has left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the people. Artists, poets, and philosophers begin to turn their attention inward, exploring themes of mortality, suffering, and the human condition in ways that were not possible before. The plague has caused people to question the meaning of life, and this deep existential questioning finds expression in the art and literature of the time. The literature of the period shifts dramatically. Writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio, whose work, The Decameron, had been a response to the plague, begin to explore themes of survival, love, and death. The medieval worldview, with its emphasis on divine authority and the afterlife, begins to give way to a more human-centered perspective. The plague has brought people face to face with the fragility of life, and they begin to look for meaning in their own experiences, rather than relying solely on religious explanations. This shift in perspective would lay the groundwork for the humanism that would come to define the Renaissance. In the world of art, the plague's influence can also be seen. Artists begin to focus more on the individual, depicting the suffering and resilience of the human spirit in ways that had never been done before. The art that emerges in the wake of the plague is more introspective, more focused on the human experience. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on the beauty of the human form and the exploration of human potential, is born from this period of devastation. It is as if the plague, in wiping out so much of the old world, has made room for something new to emerge. The Renaissance is a rebirth of art, culture, and thought. The political and social changes in Florence after the plague contribute to the larger shift occurring in Europe. The medieval period, with its rigid social hierarchies and unquestioned religious authority, begins to give way to a new era of exploration and discovery. The plague has acted as a catalyst for this transformation, pushing people to question the systems of power that had governed their lives for so long. It is in this environment that the ideas of the Renaissance begin to take root and spread throughout Europe, changing the course of history. As you walk through the city, you can feel the change in the air. The once feared silence is now filled with the sounds of rebuilding, voices of merchants negotiating, the clatter of tools as craftsmen return to their work, and the slow but steady rhythm of life returning. There is a sense of cautious optimism that grows with each passing day. The people of Florence, scarred but not defeated, are beginning to rebuild their city, their economy, and their lives. The impact of the plague, though devastating, has set in motion a process of change that will reshape the city and the world. And as the dust begins to settle, the echoes of the past remain. Florence, though forever changed, will emerge from this crisis stronger, more resilient, and more aware of the fragility of life. The city that once fell victim to the plague will now become the birthplace of a new era, the Renaissance, a time of rebirth, of new ideas, and of a renewed focus on the potential of the individual. The long-lasting impact of the plague is undeniable, but so too is the city's ability to adapt, survive, and thrive in the face of adversity. The sound of reconstruction, of economic activity gradually rising from the ashes, becomes louder with each passing day. The city is being rebuilt, not just physically, but culturally and intellectually as well. Florence, a city once ravaged by disease, is on the brink of a new beginning. The optimism that fills the air now is not one born of ignorance, but of hard-won resilience, and the knowledge that life, in all its fragility, will always find a way to endure.